A lot of what we're all preaching now is really kind of getting back to the basics.
And again, I would love to eat just a vegan diet. You know, no animals are dying, all of this stuff, but it's just not really totally aligned with human health, in my opinion, especially as you get older. The amino acids from plants don't contain the leucine and other essential amino acids that will stimulate the muscle protein synthetic pathways. When a lot of people go on a vegan diet, they might supplement with B12 or folate, but they're forgetting about the other conditionally essential carnonutrients, like I mentioned, creatine, carnitine, taurine, some of these other compounds that you're not going to get from plants, sadly. So I think that if you were to look at just one thing, it would be make sure you at least
Welcome to the Ultimate Human Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Mike Mutzel, also known as Metabolic Mike, a highly respected figure in the field of nutrition and functional medicine. Mike holds a BS in biology from Western Washington University and a master's in clinical nutrition from the University of Bridgeport. He's also a graduate of the Institute for Functional Medicine's Applying Functional Medicine in Clinical Practice program. Mike's worked extensively as a functional medicine consultant, nutritionist, and he's also the author of the highly insightful book, Belly Fat Effect. The real secret about how your diet, intestinal health, and gut bacteria help you burn fat. Through this popular YouTube channel and podcast, High Intensity Health, Mike shares cutting-edge research and practical advice for optimizing health through diet and lifestyle. Join us today as we delve into the importance of gut health, the benefits of intermittent fasting, and the latest trends in functional medicine with Mike Mutzel. Hey guys, welcome back to the Ultimate Human Podcast. I'm your host, Gary Brecka, human biologist, where we go down the road of everything anti-aging, longevity, biohacking, and everything in between. Today's guest is a figure in the field of nutrition and functional medicine. I had a chance to spend some time with him before the podcast. I think that this is going to be right in the sweet spot of my audience, and I really want to welcome to the podcast, Mike Mutzel.
Gary, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. That was a great walk we had. We got about 2,000 steps there, which was fantastic.
You know what's amazing about being in the biohacking space? Like, we both sat down to do the podcast, and then my team was like, hey, we need to back up this SD card. It's going to take 25 minutes. And you and I are like, let's get some sunlight and go for a walk.
That was awesome.
And then I almost got hit by a car because we're in London, and I didn't expect them to come from the right and not from the left.
It takes a little bit to get used to that, hey?
Yeah. And then I got turned around, but thankfully you knew your way around London somehow. Yeah. I don't know how, but he got us back to the hotel. Nice. So here we are. We're both in town for the biohacking event in London. I always talk about, with guests of mine, and I find that very often the people that are making the greatest impact in the world are the ones that have solved a problem in their life. They have gone through some sort of pain, some kind of innovative moment, and it changed the course of their life, and it led to them becoming an advocate for Lyme disease or for addiction or for physical exercise or any number of things. And we started, on our walk to talk about your trajectory from having worked in the sales industry to starting your own supplement company and some of what you've discovered along the way. So tell us a little bit about that journey that's brought you to where you are right now, one of the authorities on muscle, and it's linked to longevity and muscle as our metabolic currency.
Sure. Yeah, I would love to. It started out for me really being fatigued in college. As an undergrad, I was a pre-med biology undergrad, and
so was I.
Yeah, I love biology. Was so fun. I mean, now it's so relatable to everything we do. I just wish the professors back then would
cool
talk
now.
about.
It wasn't super fun or cool back then.
Here's the Krebs cycle, but they don't relate it to energy metabolism. It's just like this theoretical thing that happens within your cells. But I wish they could tangibly relate that to, hey, when you breathe oxygen or eat carbohydrates, this is where it goes.
Right.
So yeah, to make a long story short, so I told you, I dabbled with anabolic steroids. I wanted to be a bodybuilder early on in college, hurt my back deadlifting. And realized that, doing a couple cycles of steroids probably wasn't a good idea long term. But I really wanted to get into I loved intense exercise, and I couldn't lift weights anymore because my back hurt. And I have since resolved that through core work and everything. Got into cycling as a way to Lance Armstrong was competing in the Tour de France back then. My father is really an avid cyclist.
Fired up.
We went on a bike ride one time and just started crushing some hills. I was like, this is amazing. So I joined the bike team at my college, Western Washington University.
Okay.
And I realized after losing a lot of muscle through endurance exercise that My libido wasn't what it used to be. My energy, my confidence. I was lean and physically fit, but I realized that I was overdoing exercise and went to the school doctor, the nurse, and they said I was depressed. First time I've ever been really depressed. Like I'm talking, I can't even focus in cellular and molecular biology classes. Like I loved organic chemistry, and I used to just be a straight A student, loved all that, sat in the front of the room, couldn't follow the course. And the school nurse said, well, it's common. You're a pre-med undergrad. We'll just give you an SSRI. And I was like, that sounds not like really it's going to solve the root cause of the problem.
That sounds typical though.
Very typical, standard, just give a short-term solution for a problem that we need to unravel. So I started to dive into PubMed because we were learning how to do research and things like that. And I was learning about overexercise and how that affects and can contribute to hypogonadism. So I was just really on a quest to figure out how to resolve my own health issues. And that's how I found functional medicine. Thankfully, serendipitously, I got a job selling professional supplements to doctors that work in the functional medicine space, working with compounding pharmacists, integrative medical doctors, DOs, naturopaths, and just...
And when you say professional supplements, you mean these are supplements that are sold to physicians to use as treatments for...
Correct. Hypothyroidism, autoimmune disease. Yeah, it's a subset.
I like that you were actually in the supplement space for.
It's awesome. Yeah, there's different sort of criteria for supplements, if you will, or hierarchies. And the practitioner channel is $1 billion channel that many people don't know about.
Wow.
And in so doing, you get to work with some really great doctors that are, as you mentioned, treating Lyme disease or intestinal permeability or mold issues or thyroid issues.
Those are the trailblazers too.
Exactly.
No doubt.
They're doing things that old mentor, a friend of mine, Charles Poliquin, would always talk about how practitioners are ahead of the academic literature. Because by the time someone enrolls people in a randomized clinical trial and gets money for that, practitioners have been observing this, anecdotally, and that's what led to the clinical trial.
Right.
We can talk about the carnivore diet, for example. I mean, people have been doing that for the last 5 years. That's now just being studied academically in a randomized controlled trial format. Same with the keto diet. I mean, the keto diet's been used for well over 100 years, but before we had clinical trials for preventing dementia or treating autoimmune disease or weight loss, people were losing weight on keto, before there was clinical studies.
Yes.
So that
originally keto was for epilepsy, as I understand it, right?
Correct.
It was really done to reduce the inflammatory condition in the brain to help improve transmission speed, and it was quite successful.
Very successful. If you look at the literature, and then along came Dilantin, which was the first prescription anti-epileptic drug. And then practitioners, I think, and probably patients as well, didn't want to change their diet. It was easier to take this pill. And so the keto diet really lost favor until about the early 2000s when people started using it anecdotally.
Right.
Individuals like Jong Ro and Dom D'Agostino started utilizing this clinically. And now there was a huge resurgence in interest, not only just for lay people, but academically, looking at cancer treatments, looking at obviously treatment, refractory epilepsy, but also weight loss and all the other metabolic health applications.
It's interesting. I did a podcast with Dr. Palmer, who's a Harvard MD, PhD, I think as well. And he is treating some of the most drug-resistant mental illnesses. And I'm talking about very severe mental illness, right? Where people are literally tortured inside their own minds. Schizophrenias, paranoid schizophrenias, with diet. And I found it really, really refreshing and very exciting that someone of that caliber with that level of expertise, especially in one of the mainstream institutions, was really leaning towards things like ketogenic dieting as a way of helping treat drug-resistant mental illness. And I've used diets like the keto diet. We were talking about this before the podcast, to therapeutically help patients like Dana White and intervene for a period of time to help correct their blood work. But I didn't mean to steal the thunder from you, but we're so much on the same page, and I'm so excited about this journey because I think you're really on the same page as far as diet and muscle go and exercise. But
totally. Well, I mean, just to unpack that a little bit, I think the connection between metabolic health and cognitive health is just incredibly fascinating. And now we know the molecular pathways. When you go on a low carb ketogenic diet, for example, you can increase GABA neurotransmission in the brain, which can help improve feelings of anxiety and just the connection between normal glycemic levels and mood stability, has been well recognized for a long time. working in that practitioner channel, I got got the opportunity to speak with a lot of medical doctors, and one a friend of mine, Norm Schwartz, who was going through his residency, was working in a hospital with someone who was just really violent, very aggressive, and they had to like chain this person down to the bed, and he remembers this moment really well. And they tested her glucose, and it was over 300. And so they gave her some insulin, dropped the glucose, and all of a sudden she calmed down. And so we've all, as parents, seen young children just running around, seemingly
all the time,
impatient, like, I want this, and just really this hyper impulsive behavior. We see this in protests and college campuses and things like that. So I think it's really important that we understand that our diet and our fluctuations in the glycemic variability has a direct impact on our cognition and our mood and how we feel. So anyone with anxiety, depression, any mood issue, seasonal affective disorder, they should consider, it may not have to be full keto or carnivore, just a lower carb diet, or the diet that you and I think
especially refined carbohydrates and high sugars, things that are going to spike and drop your insulin levels like a heart monitor, right?
Correct. Yeah, we want to minimize the peaks and troughs. So just the huge swings is what we want to avoid. And when you eat a real food diet, an omnivorous real food diet, you don't get these massive ebbs and flows. Because those ebbs and flows affect our hormones. They affect, adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol. Those hormones impact neurotransmission. They affect behavior. So it's all connected. And it's not hard to see in real time, but the mainstream medical community just doesn't have time to work with patients. It's much easier to say, here's your Wellbutrin. Well,
we know that the majority of our neurotransmitters are made in the gut. Right. So you have this factory in the gut that's creating neurotransmitters. We're taking tryptophan, turning it into the neurotransmitter serotonin. It's traveling up the vagus nerve, creating mood in the brain. So you could say that, my mood starts in the brain, but it really starts in the gut. And you could say that it starts in the gut, but it really starts with what we're putting into the gut. Right. If you didn't have the essential amino acid tryptophan, you wouldn't have anything to convert into the neurotransmitter serotonin. So sometimes I think that, I'm finding that we're getting back to the basics. We're at the biggest biohacking event in London, in Europe right now. That's why we're both here. And I had a very interesting dinner last night and talking to Dr. Gundry and some just the real thought leaders in the space, yourself included. And a lot of what we're all preaching now is really kind of getting back to the basics. Totally. It's like we had figured out 1,000 years ago, we unfigured it out, and we're refiguring it out again. The best medications are coming from, Mother Nature. We're never going to be able to replace sunlight, grounding, breath work, movement, exercise, sense of purpose, all of these things that are all around us, and we're just chasing the exotics. So anyway,
it's incredibly fascinating, but I think us Western trained minds, we need this objective data to confirm what maybe our ancestors did inherently. And so I'm all about, like you, looking at the research and trying to prove these methodologies, because it does come across to mainstream people as sort of witchcrafty or a little bit woo-woo. But when you actually start to do this, you feel so much better. You look better, you age better. So yeah, I agree. We are sort of just reconfirming what our ancestors inherently did. But I think going back to the gut, there's one thing I want to highlight there, and I spoke a lot about this in my book, Belly Fat Effect, and you talked about the gut and tryptophan and all this. There's also bad actors or pro-inflammatory bacterial fragments in the intestine known as endotoxin. And so when we start to eat the French fries, the processed foods, we overconsume alcohol, we start to release some of those gram-negative bacterial fragments and cause a porousness in our small intestine. People know about intestinal permeability or leaky gut. And this can happen meal to meal. You can have really good gut health and then go eat fast food and have a milkshake and French fries. It's really the high refined carbohydrates with oils together that creates this phenomenon of increased intestinal permeability. And when these bacterial fragments get into your body, they cause the symptoms of depression, anxiety.
Is that endotoxemia?
Correct.
Because I've used that term I've heard that term kind of thrown around. That, and the endotoxemia is highly prevalent in autism and other neuroinflammatory conditions, Alzheimer's, dementia. We think they're caused by these plaque formations and these neurofibrillary tangles, but those are the consequences of the inflammatory process for a period of time. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think there's ample evidence to support that, but even just common metabolic health issues. You look at There's blood endotoxin levels correlate with visceral fat tissue, so just belly fat, the degree of insulin resistance. And so we look at these foods and we know they're high glycemic or processed, but mechanistically, what are they doing in addition to releasing glucose and insulin because they're so hyperpalatable and so on? They're causing changes to the gut ecology and the integrity of the intestine. And as a consequence of that, you're poisoning yourself with bacterial fragments. And so when we think about metabolic endotoxemia, Patrice Canny, he's in Belgium, I believe, has done a lot of research on this. And even just alcohol consumption. And I'm not an anti-alcohol person per se. I tried a year of alcohol free. I'm like 470 days alcohol free now.
Are you? Yeah.
Feel just much better cognitively.
Yeah.
I mean, I miss every now and again a biodynamic wine, but the juice isn't worth the squeeze in my opinion.
Totally agree.
But anyway, alcohol will increase the absorption of these bacterial inflammagens. There was a study at Boston College that randomized people to drink 1 drink or up to 4. They just took shots of vodka with a little orange juice. And the feelings, blood alcohol level correlated really tightly with endotoxin levels. So the feeling of a hangover, we're thinking, it's the ethanol or it's the acetaldehyde.
Right.
It could be that the bacterial fragments from your gut coming into the blood, creating inflammation, which creates the symptomology of a hangover. So if you're going to binge drink, you definitely want to have maybe some polyphenols, some organic wine, or even just a little bit of orange juice or maybe pomegranate juice to mitigate that, or just not binge drink at all.
Or just not binge drink. There's that option as well. But what were you saying, just so I heard it correctly, you're the amount of alcohol and the degree of the hangovers was related to the level of endotoxin?
Yeah, there was a parallel increase with the blood alcohol level and blood endotoxin level.
Oh, as the alcohol rose, the endotoxin level rose.
Right.
And this was what you're referring to as making the gut more permeable. So these endotoxins were
Getting in.
You're causing endotoxemia and inflammation by drinking the alcohol, in addition to making the blood more acidic, in addition to the acetaldehyde. So lots of consequences.
And then the investigators also looked at inflammatory byproducts. So they looked at interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha from macrophages and monocytes, and that correlated parallel with blood alcohol as well as metabolic endotoxemia. So binge drinking, the feeling of being buzzed is linked with more inflammation. And then we know that obviously that people who binge drink will have more prevalences of dementia, cognitive decline. Well, if you're increasing TNF-alpha and interleukin-6 in your brain, you're going to exacerbate, the decline of your cognitive capacities and beyond. So,
no question.
Incredibly interesting
No
stuff.
questions. One of the things that you said was eating a whole omnivorous diet. Yeah. So I didn't want that to fly by without us taking a deep dive, because my audience is also always looking for evidence-based mechanisms to help them make good dietary choices. I'm a big believer in whole foods, eating whole real foods as close to the soil as possible. I mean, very often it's not, in my opinion, it's not the food itself, it's the distance from the food to the table. Yeah. We take a lot of harmless compounds and really make them harmful by the time they make it to your table. But what do you mean by a diverse omnivorous?
Yeah, I like to emphasize the omnivorous aspect of it, because when we talk about a whole foods diet, we often hear that sort of obfuscated with a plant-based diet. And I grow vegetables. I have 400 square feet of garden space. We have raspberries, tomatoes, apples, pears, a lot of blueberries. I love.
You want to push your limits and feel your best? Hi, I'm Gary Brecka, and plunge is your secret weapon. Cold plunging can reduce muscle soreness, boost energy, and enhance mental clarity. With regular cold plunging, you'll support your immune system and even elevate your mood. It's more than recovery, it's a lifestyle. Take the plunge, change your life. Visit plunge.com and shop now.
Fruits and vegetables, right? But I think that the powers that be are really pushing a plant-based diet. And when people just start eating a plant-based diet, they're getting hyperpalatable, meat-like alternatives, that are vegan junk food. And a recently published study in The Lancet actually just showed, this was days ago, that a plant-based diet, if it contains vegan junk food, which is what most people are consuming.
I think I saw this. We got to put a link to this into the show notes.
I'll text you that.
I saw it getting on the plane. I didn't have a chance to download it. Was it in The Lancet?
It was.
Okay.
It's published, I think, Tuesday. I think incredibly fascinating, because again, we have Stanford and Harvard and these institutions really foisting this diet, saying that as long as you don't eat red meat, that you're okay, right? You can get all your protein needs and requirements, amino acid requirements from plants. There's no reason to have animal foods in your diet.
Saw that too.
But now we know that these, especially when you're eating processed plant-based foods, and most of the plant-based foods, most people are not eating a lot of vegetables and whole foods when they start to go on a vegan diet. They're getting a lot of processed foods, Beyond Meat, Impossible Burger.
No question.
And that's just, it's processed junk food essentially. And we now have research that shows that this is linked with higher prevalences of dying from all causes and cardiovascular specific mortality.
Wow. Because, there's obviously other plant-based research that indicates the opposite, but it was always fascinating to me that I think you can make that argument for any diet. But if you're a vegan, and this isn't to attack vegan diets particularly, but to say that you could eat white flour, white rice, white bread, white pasta, white potatoes, and beer, right? Which would all be vegan,
or your cookies,
or cookies, and so that's your diet. There's no question that that's not healthy, but it's vegan. So and you could make an argument for non-grass fed, non-grass finished meats and highly toxic, carnivore based products too. I think when we say whole foods, we mean in their purest form. Without being highly processed, because you could eat a lot of processed meats,
keto
high
junk food.
nitrates, keto junk food, seed oils, things like that. Because you can have a clean keto diet, you can have a dirty keto diet, right? If you were eating a lot of, processed salad dressings, for example, they're high in palm oil and canola oils. You would be keto, but you would be in a pro-inflammatory state. And so I think that, that's one of the reasons why I don't advocate hardcore particular for any dogmatic diet. But keep going. So you said that, really the research indicates by having meat in the diet, clean sourced, I'm assuming.
More grass-fed.
Grass-fed.
Things like that. But just more whole foods from an omnivorous standpoint. And the nail in the coffin for me was a study in 2018 that looked at whole blood essential fatty acids and looked at the omega-3 index and the byproducts of that. I'm sure you've talked about this, these so-called resolvins that are created as a consequence of eating fish and animal-derived foods, that the EPA and DHA, the health-promoting long-chain omega-3s, they're converted into these anti-inflammatory metabolites that are specific for reducing inflammation, particularly in the brain. And they wanted to look at these metabolites as well as the omega-3 index and levels of linoleic acid, which is an 18-carbon long fatty acid that's really derived from vegetable oil, and how that can be converted more preferentially into pro-inflammatory products. And these investigators in the UK actually looked at whole blood essential fatty acids with linoleic acid and then their downstream metabolites into these so-called omega-3 resolving compounds. The vegan dieters had zero levels of these anti-inflammatory resolving mediators, these so-called pro-resolvings. Some people call them SPMs. There's different supplements out there that sort of quantify or isolate these anti-inflammatory compounds. In contrast to the omnivorous diet group, where they had significantly higher levels of omega-3 fats in their whole blood, much lower levels of linoleic acid, and much higher levels of these anti-inflammatory long-chain polyunsaturated omega-3 derived compounds. So for me, that was really the icing on the cake. And then a recently published study this year looked at, we'll talk about muscle, I'm sure, later.
To say that seed oils were the culprit, you're saying, rather than meat-based fats.
Correct.
Is what you're getting at.
That more of the vegan dieters were getting much higher levels in thetheir diet of linoleic acid derived seed oils. So probably canola, probably cottonseed with Crisco and whatever else. It's really soy, canola, and cottonseed are really where people.
I've been censored by the Canola Oil Society of Canada.
It's insane.
I didn't know there was actually a Canola Oil Society of Canada. It's called rapeseed, by the way, guys. Canola is sort of a brand name, but even in my rant on seed oils, I wasn't particularly attacking the seed itself, but what I said was, when you industrial process these, right, you put them in a commercial press, it comes out gummy, you degum it with hexane, which we know is a neurotoxin, then you heat it to 405 degrees, turn it rancid, and then you deodorize it with sodium hydroxide, which we know is also a carcinogen. And then some of them are commercially bleached, and then and then bottled and then put on the shelf. I mean, you'll never convince me. I don't care how clean the plant started.
Yeah.
If it ends with sodium hydroxide and hexane and potentially, commercial bleach, and then even at safe levels, then you'll never convince me that that's somehow
Healthy.
good for you, healthy and non-pro-inflammatory. And there's a lot of indications now that are starting to, take the blame off of the infamous LDL cholesterol molecule as just being at the scene of the crime, not pulling the trigger, and these pro-inflammatory compounds that are really calling the inflammation to the damage in the endothelial wall. Would you kind of agree with that?
I agree wholeheartedly with that. And I think there's this whole LDL oxidation hypothesis, that it's not the LDL inherently going around and damaging your coronary arteries. It's that the oxidation is initiating the process of atherosclerotic plaque formation. And part of that oxidation is the high prevalence of linoleic acid in our blood and in our cells. And so I think the omega-3 index is nice. Bill Harris has done a lot of research on helping us better understand when our omega-3 index, and I have no financial ties with the company, it's a $49 test, and it can help to basically enumerate and give us better ideas about sudden cardiac death.
And what's that test looking at?
The proportion of omega-3s in your red blood cells. It's a blood spot test.
Blood spot test. Is that the Dr. Gundry was giving me one that he thought, because I want to put that test in the show notes. Yeah,
that's a good
It's not
one.
a test that my company runs. We do 74 biomarkers in the blood. We do 5 markers in the genes, and I think that helps you target supplementation. But certainly looking at the processing of fatty acids in the red blood cell would be a great test. Say the name one more time.
It's the omega-3 index. The
Omega-3
company's
index.
Omega Quant. They're out of Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Okay.
I actually went and visited him, did a podcast with him. I've been a fan of that work for a while. But yeah, when you eat an omnivorous diet, the point is that your omega-3 index and your levels of these health-promoting omega-3s and their metabolic byproducts are going to be higher compared to if you eat a vegan diet. And the consequence of having high linoleic acid in your red blood cells and other cells could be they're more prone to oxidation.
Right.
And that could contribute to, among other things, atherosclerosis or the narrowing of your very small coronary arteries, causing plaque, and even clotting cascades. And then I think almost even more importantly is the half-life of linoleic acid when you eat it is about 600 days. So
That's what I heard.
it's insane when you start to look at this, and we are having orders of magnitude more linoleic acid. If you look at consumption of linoleic acid in the 1990s compared to now, it's like 300%. Every restaurant, every processed food item has canola oil.
Because it's cheap and we can deep fry in it, and it tastes just like some of the other oils that are healthier for you. So we can, and it denatures even at high temperatures, but we still fry in it. Right.
And the repeatedly fried stuff is the problematic. When you look at that, all the oxidation products and advanced glycation end products that are created as a result of that are problematic. So yeah, I think that's why I emphasize the whole food omnivorous diet. And again, another nail in the coffin was just looking at muscle protein synthesis, comparing a protein matched omnivorous versus vegan diet, and looking at the rates of muscle protein synthesis. And we know that as you get older, muscle is even more important compared to when you're younger. It's harder to stimulate skeletal muscle as you get older. There's sort of this anabolic
You mean grams
resistance.
per kilogram of body weight equated for plant versus animal derived, and keeping those grams the same, and what was the muscle synthesis outcome? So
I want to say, the difference was between 40 and 60%. It was pretty massive.
Yeah.
Because eating and again, I would love to eat just a vegan diet. No animals are dying, all of this stuff, but it's just not really totally aligned with human health, in my opinion, especially as you get older.
I would agree with that.
Because you just need the amino acids from plants don't contain the leucine and other essential amino acids that will stimulate the muscle protein synthetic pathways.
Okay.
So those two studies for me were like, okay, this is why we really should be pushing a whole food omnivorous style diet.
Okay. So with meats, clean source meats as the foundation, and vegetables, and would you say fruits?
Yeah,
in very limited quantities.
Correct. And a friend of mine, Stan Efferding, he's done a lot with the vertical diet, really big in the bodybuilding space. Something that I borrowed from him is eating vegetables that agree with you. So I think a lot of people think, oh, cauliflower is healthy or kale is healthy. Most people, the brassica derived vegetables, they don't do well with that. They end up having a lot of GI issues and so forth. So for me, it's like having fermented vegetables. So having kimchi, sauerkraut, olives, for example, coconut, avocado. So you can get a lot of diversity in there. And these are low anti-nutrient, low oxalate vegetables and fruits that you can digest readily, that support gut health, that have the polyphenols that are healthy for you, and that taste good. That's the most important thing. You know, I think honestly for autoimmunity, for GI issues, for depression, going carnivore is amazing. But most people get kind of bored of having ribeyes or just ground beef all day long every day. So adding that diversity, again, with whole foods that don't upset your stomach and GI tract.
Yeah, and you said, you know, depression going carnivore, and I don't want to gloss over that because I think that you're really on to something that we've noticed not just anecdotally in our practice, because we see a voluminous amount of new patients on a monthly basis. We provide supplements that you find in carnivore-based diets, and meaning B vitamins, B complexes, methylfolates, things like that. And we do see a significant impact on what patients, at least anecdotally, report as depressive symptoms, symptoms of anxiety, ADD, ADHD. So talk about that a little bit as it relates to the carnivore diet. What's the mechanism of what's going on there? Why do some of these elimination diets have such profound effects? For people, and why do you think it is that modern medicine is not very accepting of, you know, just the impact of diet on overall well-being, even mental illness? I can't tell you the number of patients that have come to see my clinical team that have been discharged from oncology treatments. So these are people that have finished chemotherapy, and it will say dietary recommendations, none. We see it all the time. So I'd love to dive into this a little bit with respect to the carnivore.
On more granular details. So the first part of your question is mechanistically, how is this working? I think it's multifactorial. I think, you know, as you alluded to, the different levels of micronutrients that are very specific for improving cognition and the synthesis of critically important neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, et cetera. I think that's part of it. You are getting, you know, you're getting more zinc, you're getting B12, you're getting folate, thiamine, and then the omega-3s, like we alluded to. I think that's part of it. I think on the flip side, it's just lower in inflammation. So when you, and the medical community doesn't really understand that well, because we've been told red meat is inflammatory. Red meat has saturated fat. Saturated fat is bad for you because it's purportedly linked with heart disease. Although we now know that that data is really not sussed out, which we can talk about later. Agreed. So I think it's hard for mainstream medicine to grapple with that. But in my opinion, it just minimizes the amount of anti-nutrients and problem compounds that can contribute to feelings of dis-ease or malaise, supporting gut health and beyond. One study found, several studies, I think a lot of people with depression have GI issues. You know,
I mean, almost
strong correlation.
I don't know that I've ever had a client that complains of any significant level of anxiety that didn't also have gut issues.
Yeah, and a lot of people with gut issues, they are in a high fiber diet
there, amongst other things.
Yeah, that link, but also just the fiber. You know, I think there's this myth that if you have more fiber, it's going to improve your gut health. And a lot of people that eat high fiber diets, they either have tenesmus and they're going to the bathroom multiple times a day, have no warning. Once they get the urge, they have to go. Or you have people that are constipated. And numerous studies now show that lower fiber diets are actually better for gastrointestinal issues than higher fiber diets. But this one study or a group in China has been tracking individuals as a gastroenterology clinic. And there's such a bias in people towards fiber, even though that when they went on a low fiber diet in this particular study, it improved their GI symptoms, but they reverted to a high fiber diet and their symptoms came back. So there's this bias that we have to have some threshold of 20 or 25 grams of fiber per day.
Right.
So I think if you are having GI issues and you eat a high fiber diet, it behooves you to modify the amount of fiber that you're eating so as to see clinical resolvement in your, you know, gastrointestinal problems, especially if it comes to constipation or tenesmus.
Yeah. You know, I've certainly seen that. I think you're right. Part of it is the elimination of the anti-nutrients, and part of it is the inclusion of what we need for to not have the absence of the basics. You know, all human beings need 2 essential fatty acids, 8 essential amino acids, 91 essential minerals. And as we get depleted in those areas, I think we get the expression of disease. And then we go chasing the disease that's in the leaf instead of the nutrient depletion in the soil. And, you know, I find that's why sometimes these types of elimination diets can be the panacea for people. They're not the panacea for everybody. And I think being hyper dogmatic for a prolonged period of time is usually not sustainable.
Right.
But in the short period of time, they can be, you know, life-saving. I mean,
Very effective. And then moreover, the other conditionally essential micronutrients that are found in an omnivorous diet, for example, carnitine, creatine, these other very important carna-derived, animal-derived nutrients are really important for metabolic health. Creatine really helps with cellular energy production. It helps in the brain. There's numerous studies that find that creatine helps with cognitive recall and memory, especially in elderly people. So I think that's another part of it as well. It's not just the B12 and the folate and all this. You know, when a lot of people go on a vegan diet, they might supplement with B12 or folate, but they're forgetting about the other conditionally essential carnonutrients, like I mentioned, creatine, carnitine, taurine, some of these other compounds that you're not going to get from plants, sadly. So supplementing with that, I think, is helpful if you don't eat enough red meat. But several studies, and there's a researcher in Australia, I can't remember her name, she's looked at putting, especially women who are have anemia and issues with iron absorption and so forth, and depression, putting them on a whole foods animal-based diet, and correlating that with possibly the creatine and other parts of the meat matrix that we don't really talk about that are very helpful.
Yeah, and I think when you see a normalization of hormones, you can even see the anemias being affected. We know that men and women that have clinically deficient levels of testosterone, free testosterone, have a higher propensity for anemia. You know, their red blood cell counts are lower, their hemoglobin levels are lower, their hematocrit, their blood viscosity is usually lower. And then when they either go on hormone therapy or they go on supplements to support healthy hormone production like DHEA, D3, boron if they're dealing with SHBG, then as their hormone levels come back, boom, the anemia seems to fade away and their energy level returns and their sleep returns and what have you. So what is a normal, what does a day in the life of Mike Mutzel look like from a dietary standpoint? How are you wandering around London right now?
It's a good question. It is a little bit hard when you travel.
Yeah.
But at home, I have backyard chickens, so eggs
You
are
do?
a
Oh, that's
staple.
great.
We have 17 chickens, 1 rooster. And it's great because my daughter gets involved with that, and we use the manure for the garden and all that. And it really connects
Super
you with
cool.
your food.
Yeah.
So we have fertilized eggs because we have a rooster. So I'll do raw egg yolks in a smoothie, for example, with some blueberries and some grass-fed whey protein. But I eat generally 2 to 3 meals a day based upon my activity level.
Right.
So I think, people get really hyper-focused on how much protein to have, how much food to have. And I base this as sort of, it's like fuel in the tank. How much do I need to fuel what I'm trying to do? If I'm going to do a 20-mile, 2-day backpacking trip, I'm going to eat a lot more food than if I'm just sitting around doing podcasting or video editing or whatever else. But generally 2 to 3 meals per day, 30 to 50 grams of protein per meal. Okay. And very heavy on protein, red meat, grass-fed, or wild-caught game that I've harvested myself. I work with a local rancher and get cuts from him. Try to cook in a slow cooker as much as possible. So using bone-in, whole food, derived, we'll do, ribeye, of course, with the bone-in. We'll do rib steak, rump roast. I mean, you name it. But I love to saute onions in ghee, put that in the slow cooker, and cook it on low and slow. With rosemary, for example, and cook a roast or a grass-fed, just ground beef. And then mix, my daughter is an athlete. She's really into track. And so we'll do some sprouted rice.
Do they like to eat like that too, your kids?
Yeah. She's actually never had fast food ever.
Really?
So
good for her.
It's
crazy? I bet if she did, it would taste like chemicals to her. Whereas, someone that's brought up on, having access to a lot of fast food, their palate changes.
Totally.
And they would prefer not to eat whole foods. They actually prefer the taste of artificial sweeteners and and fried and processed foods.
Yeah, what we're doing to kids is so sad, Gary.
I think so too.
The studies, Journal of the American Medical Association in 2021 found that 65% of the calories that kids are eating is coming from hyperpalatable, ultra-processed junk food. And so we are training our children.
65%.
It's almost 3/4. Wow. I mean, in some households, it's 100%. I mean, you've taken your kids to birthday parties and whatever else. And we are rewarding our kids with junk food. If they do well, we give them junk food. Oh, it's Valentine's Day. It's so-and-so's birthday. It's, St. Patrick's Day.
We're on a road trip. It's Cheetos and Doritos and MSG and, fake cheese. I mean, it's, because you're on a road trip. And it's what we do in the kids' classrooms. We bring donuts to school. We bring processed, bagels to school. I think that the school lunches and a lot of times in the public school system are.
Hey guys, I'm really excited to announce this. Perfect Aminos has gotten a serious upgrade. They've added nucleotides, the building blocks of our nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. And this is important. We know essential amino acids are the building blocks of protein and collagen. Having all the essential amino acids in the correct ratio is necessary for complete protein synthesis without the caloric impact. But if we want perfect protein synthesis, we need to look at the process of protein synthesis itself. Because if the process is faulty, we won't get the correctly made protein, collagen, fibrin, or the red blood cells in our bloodstream or our muscles. We can even stop creation of specific proteins, which can affect us in so many different ways. Our DNA and our RNA are what direct protein synthesis, building new proteins. If our DNA or RNA get damaged from toxins, harmful bacteria, or just plain aging, we get faulty protein synthesis. So cells, enzymes, and hormones are less functional and we get premature aging. By adding nucleosides and nucleotides, the building blocks of the nucleic acids DNA and RNA, our cells get exactly what they need to help repair faulty DNA and RNA and improve the process of protein synthesis itself. This is next level science, and you need to try these.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
We usually made lunch for all of our kids growing through until they graduated from high school, and now luckily they're all adults and they're in control of their choices, and for the most part, they eat very, very healthy.
Nice.
But how does a typical American family get ahead of this? I mean, because if your kids are going to public school. And what we feed kids mostly in the morning, Pop-Tarts, cereals, bagels. They're not only nutritionless, but I believe that they have a lot of anti-nutrients in them, like folic acid, which is a non-natural form of folate, like cyanocobalamin, which is a very non-bioavailable form of B12. And then, lots of empty calories that make them hungry again. So what are some tips and tricks for getting your kids on the bandwagon? And then I want to ask you some questions about our muscle discussion we had.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I don't have all the solutions, but I think cooking with fat and using salt is key. So my daughter loves lamb, and lamb happens to be very fatty. And so a lot of the food that I cook for her is in the slow cooker, add in a lot of real salt. I'm a big fan of the Redmond real salt, and use garlic and spices and just make it taste good.
Right.
So she wants to eat it. And most importantly, getting your child to feel the tangible effects of how that food is impacting their health and how they feel, and getting them involved in the process too. We go to the store together. She's picking out the fruit she wants. I say, okay, well, what do you think about this lamb? You want more eggs, more yogurt? So in the morning, it's yogurt and berries, and I'll sneak in some whey protein. So it's very simple for her.
And just mix it into the yogurt or kefir or whatever you're making in the morning.
Totally.
Okay.
And if I add raw egg yolks, it makes it really rich. I mean, the things that we like are salt, sugar, and fat. So if we add more fat and salt or a little sweet from the berries, then she's going to enjoy it.
Right.
And, I think it's hard once your kid is addicted to processed food to get them off.
Right.
And that may be where a vacation or some sort of elimination diet comes in. I don't have all the tools for that, but we slowly weaning kids off of that, it really affects her performance. And she can run a mile in just shy of 6 minutes.
Wow.
And so she's
doing. She's how old?
She's 11.
Wow, she's fast.
So she's super fast, and
that's great. Good for her.
She can do on a hike. I mean, we've done a 22-mile hike in one day before, and that was when she was 9. So she's and so she gets it. And so she's very unique, but I think it's important. Any kid could do what she does. It's not like she's genetically gifted. We just have primed her mitochondria and her exercise capacity and her diet so she doesn't crave these things. She's in bed by 9, you know, no screens, no iPhones, things like that. But getting back to the nuts and bolts, what do parents do? Just not buy the processed food, not buy the packaged food, and learn how to cook. Cooking is a lost art.
I think so too, and it doesn't have to take a long time. I mean, I love to cook. I constantly posting what we're cooking on our, you know, on my Instagram channel. One of the things we talked about that I think you and Dr. Gabrielle Lyon are doing a very good job bringing to the forefront is the importance of muscle, not just exercise, but our actual muscle mass over our lifetime. And I think. Again, both of you guys out there, you know, are bringing this more into the mainstream, muscle being our metabolic currency and being more than just something that looks aesthetically pleasing. It's not really considered by mainstream modern medicine to be an organ.
Right.
You referred to it as an organ today, which I tend to agree with. But talk a little bit about where, you know, your journey has led you to really prioritizing muscle, and what supporting evidence is there that muscle is our metabolic currency?
Yeah, well, there's tons of research there. I mean, I've been fascinated with muscle since I was just a little kid, watching Jean-Claude Van Damme and Arnold Schwarzenegger, just the aesthetic side of it. And it was just serendipitous that now we have this dossier of literature supporting the fact that muscle and muscle mass and strength are independent variables that will predict longevity.
Yeah, grip strength.
You know, and speaking of grip strength, there was a recently published study that found that people who have better grip strength age biologically slower compared to people who are weaker. Wow. And so we hear a lot, you know, we're at a longevity conference, this whole field of geroscience or longevity science. You know, people are taking, you know, NAD boosters or getting IVs or methylene blue. All that stuff is fine. But if you're not strong, good luck trying to live to 180. I mean, how are you going to get up and go to the bathroom by yourself? And so strength, I think, is really important, and prioritizing exercises that support strength. And it turns out zone 2 training, as good as it may be for capillary density and your aerobic base, it doesn't necessarily translate into improved strength.
Right.
And so I think that's the most important thing that we should prioritize. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, numerous studies emerged. People who are more likely to die from COVID had low grip strength.
Yes.
We have multiple studies.
Low grip strength, low vitamin D3, and the more frail, the higher the incidence. Totally agree with you. As a mortality expert, we saw that. Yeah, higher visceral fat, lower body mass index, people that were very sarcopenic from age-related muscle wasting, much, much higher. It didn't have to do with the diameter, it had to do with the density of the muscle and fat ratio. I read some of those, you know, studies myself. So for somebody listening to the podcast, that's a lot of my audience is not sedentary, but we have sedentary family members, friends and family. What's the importance of getting off the couch and getting mobile, and like how can somebody incorporate strength training into their daily routine? Where do they start? Yeah,
it's a great question. To tackle the importance, so recent NHANES data, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, this is the longest ongoing cohort study in the US, finds that 96% of us are on some spectrum of being insulin resistant. And
96%?
Yeah, so only about 4% of US adults are metabolically healthy.
Wow.
And so when we think about our organs of metabolism, we tend to think about the liver and the pancreas and fat tissue. But our muscle is where most 80% of glucose is disposed into muscle. So it's really a glucose and insulin sink. It's also a leptin sink. Yeah. So if you want to be leptin sensitive, you want to focus on muscle. So that's what I think is the why. We want to support metabolic health by prioritizing muscle strength and I think just capacity and muscle health, really.
And why is it important to be leptin sensitive?
Yeah, so leptin, it turns out, is really, it helps regulate, or is critically important in appetite control and regulation. But I think even more importantly, leptin is a pro-inflammatory, immunologically active signaling molecule. So the more leptin you have as a consequence of being overweight or over fat, the more inflamed you're going to be. And that's why I think leptin is so problematic. In the early or late 90s, early 2000s, it was all about the leptin resistance diet.
Right. I've read all about that too.
You know, so, and that's fascinating. And really leptin resistance correlates with insulin resistance. So you don't really, people can test their leptin levels. You want to do it first thing in the morning fasted. because there is a diurnal rhythm of leptin secretion and so on. You can test that, but the best way to ascertain whether or not you have high leptin levels is just to look at your body fat.
And what about looking at insulin when you're looking at a glycemic profile and you're looking at glucose, hemoglobin A1C, the 3-month marker of blood sugar, and insulin? Where do you like to see those biomarkers? If people are going out and getting data on their body, where do you like to see those biomarkers?
Wonderful question, Gary. I think having a fasted insulin under 5 is ideal. There's really no need for high fasting insulin. If you think about what does insulin do, it helps us in the post-meal window to partition the energy that we ate. So if it is high in the fasted state, that would suggest to many of us that there is some degree with post-meal processing because of being sedentary. We can talk about how being sedentary causes hyperinsulinemia, but also just eating too much processed food. And so I like to see fasted insulin under 5. Most people are between 5 and 7, know. So it really depends on your last meal. And by the way, I do like to see postprandial insulin as well. Once people have a baseline, about 90 to 120 minutes after a meal, it is good, to look at your non-fasted insulin and non-fasted glucose, as well as non-fasted triglycerides.
And where would you like to see postprandial insulin, let's say 2 hours out from a meal?
Yeah, like under 12.
Under 12.
Generally.
Okay.
And glucose under 125, and then triglycerides, it depends on how much fat that individual had with the meal, but triglycerides generally under 150.
Fasted?
Yeah, post-meal.
Oh, post-meal.
Fasted, I like to see them low, like 70, 65, 70.
Yeah. I would agree with that.
Triglycerides, and this is what, by the way, not to interrupt you, why I got off the Bulletproof Coffee. I mean, I love Dave Asprey and what he does, but I was having a lot of these Bulletproof Coffees, and I was learning about this lipid load test that was emerging in the literature. So I looked at my post-meal triglyceride levels after having a Bulletproof Coffee, and my triglycerides jumped to 220. And fasted, they're 60. So to me, I was like, this liquid fat, as health promoting as it may be, maybe for enhancing ketone levels, was not doing me any favors in the post-meal window. Right. So I really tamed that down.
Right. And a lot of that is, well, I mean, not with Dave Asprey's, but, is coming, well, people are getting those fats from pro-inflammatory sources of fats and even seed oils. I know people are putting seed oils right into their coffee. It's not grass-fed butter or the MCT oils. It's, it's the high levels of seed oils. What's interesting is, we knew in the mortality space when we would look at people's cholesterol profiles and their lipid levels that people that had elevated levels of LDL cholesterol and low triglycerides were generally markers for longevity. People that had the same level of LDL cholesterol and elevated triglycerides over a period of time, it would be a marker for cardiovascular disease. And why do you think that is? Does it have to do with the particulate size of cholesterol? There's a lot of hypotheses surrounding cholesterol as being the culprit. Right. When I think it's at the scene of the crime, but not pulling the trigger.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the remnant lipoproteins that are related to the elevated levels of triglycerides. And so these are very atherogenic, the VLDLs, the remnant lipids, and these tend to correlate on par with triglyceride levels. So if you have high fasted triglycerides and post-meal triglycerides, you're going to have high levels of these very atherogenic remnant lipoproteins that are much more problematic than just LDL. So I think the context in which LDL is particularly problematic is if you have low HDL and high triglycerides. Right. And this has been repeated in the literature, and now we know about the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. Dave Feldman has really helped us better understand this literature for a long time. So when individuals have a high high LDL cholesterol, I automatically look to their lipids, their triglycerides and HDL. And so if their triglycerides are say 60 or 70 and their HDL is around 60, 70 or in that ballpark, I really don't get too concerned about the LDL. Right. But when we see this hypertriglyceridemia, elevated levels of blood triglycerides with high LDL.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Then there is more of an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. We
saw exactly the same thing. The opposite correlation with low triglycerides and high LDL than with both of those being elevated as being markers for cardiovascular disease. Right. So if someone is starting out and wants to get data on their body, what are some of these? Because I think you could go down the rabbit hole of biomarkers until you get paralysis of analysis, right? And I think I think LabCorp has something like 1,500 panels that you can pull, right?
Yeah.
And so where does somebody start? Like, what data would you say were the 3 or 4 most important things to look at?
Love that.
In the blood.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you include all these on what you do, but I like to get a baseline of just your Chem24 and CBC. So just your standard potassium, albumin, white blood cell count, high sensitivity C-reactive protein. And if you're going to run LDL, you might as well run ApoB and ApoA1. It's $17 to add on, and that will help you better understand, the potential atherogenicity of your high LDL.
Right. So if you have those ApoAs or ApoBs, I have ApoA.
Okay.
So I'm starting on a niacin protocol.
Sure.
My cholesterol, triglycerides are amazing. HDL is amazing. VLDL's low single digits, but the ApoA. So I'm going on a niacin protocol, and I'm going to track it and post about it. But so you would do full cholesterol, triglyceride panel,
Liver enzymes, including GGT. For whatever reason, that's often omitted. I never understood why we omit that. But the liver really tells you what's going on metabolically, because the first place you start to fill up with fat ectopically, outside of your fat cells, is your liver, your pancreas, and your muscle. So if your liver is starting to reflect fat buildup, those AST, ALT, GGT will start to increase over 25 or 30. And so I like to look at those because they really not only look at metabolic health, but also the toxin load. And we know that if we're filled up with these so-called obesogens, these toxins, well, it's going to be hard to be healthy and lose weight. So I like to look at occupational exposure to toxins. What does your house look like? Do you have perfumes, the conventional scented candles?
I live in the mold capital of the world.
Yeah, Florida.
Yeah, in Miami. So do you recommend that? So you think a hormone panel, glycemic panel, looking at glucose, hemoglobin A1C,
iron,
CBC, the complete blood count, comprehensive metabolic panel. And then when you say toxic loads, what are you referring to?
Well, I think just measuring that can be tough. I mean, I know there's boutique labs that look at blood levels of persistent organic pollutants and heavy metals and things like that. I think I would
way down the rabbit hole of that stuff.
Yeah. So I would just look at your liver function test initially, and then look at more symptoms and then occupational exposure, that way. But if GGT is pretty high, like in the 60s, for example, then I would suggest, or we want to look at maybe a glutathione need, because GGT can increase as a consequence of increased glutathione turnover. That enzyme is involved in the pulling of glutamine glycine in to make glutathione tripeptide. So I'll look at that. Fibrinogen I like to look at as well.
Fibrinogen.
Yeah, because of the clotting potential, and then especially if LDL is high. There's a strong correlation with potentially blood clotting and more blood viscosity. So I look at also the hemoglobin hematocrit as well, especially in men on HRT, that tends to increase.
Yep.
And so sometimes we recommend blood donation for individuals.
Therapeutic phlebotomy. When the hematocrit level for male hematocrit getting what, in your 50s?
Yeah, if it's Gary, I like to look at unearned. So if your hematocrit is 47 and you've never been to the gym, that's an unearned hematocrit. If you're not an endurance athlete, why would your hematocrit be 47?
Right.
So it's kind of like some people say, oh, my HDL cholesterol is 120, and you eat like crap. You're like, well, that's not an earned high HDL. Right. So the same thing with hematocrit. If you don't live at altitude and you don't exercise, your hematocrit shouldn't be close to 50. I mean, this is what people in the Tour de France would love to have, a high hematocrit. But that's earned from years of exercise. So that you kind of differentiate that along with the hemoglobin, especially in men, it gets close to 18 or 19. That's going to suggest more. Well, first of all, iron is pro-inflammatory, can be. And then just thick, viscous blood. That can contribute to this process of atherosclerosis. So, sort of helping people to better understand that. Very simple stuff. You can gather a lot of insights from just a basic Chem24 and CBC.
Yeah, that's what I try to tell people, is that you should just get a starting point, get some data, because what you can measure, you can change, right? So the Chem24, and And what other basic data are you a big believer in? Body mass index, looking at visceral fat versus body fat versus overall muscle, and then tracking that to see if you're making progress?
I do like the bioimpedance or a DEXA.
Yeah,
I do. I think
Two
that's
simple,
very helpful.
Yeah.
A colleague of mine, friend, Sean O'Mara, he does a lot with the visceral fat MRI.
Okay.
And he's found that just motivate the patients that he's working with.
Yeah.
When they see that their abdominal region is filled up with fat, it's going to motivate them to not have the ice cream and the cookies and the crackers.
Right.
And so I think if you have access to that and paying cash, we're talking $400 or $500, that can really motivate people to adhere to lifestyle change.
Yeah.
But I'm more of a big fan of other objective markers, like looking at your VO2 max, doing that once a year.
Yeah.
It's not just for athletes. You want to get a baseline of where your strength and fitness is, because going back to the importance of muscle, we're going to lose that as we age. Yeah. So slowing down that loss, I think, is really important. So having these objective biomarkers, we don't have any way to really characterize this, but how many pull-ups can you do? How many push-ups? How many squats? I mean, this is real stuff. Right. It's not just for fitness junkies. We know about grip strength and biologic aging. The weaker you are, the faster you will age biologically. The more likely you will die from all causes. So why aren't we looking at objective ways to quantify and enumerate this? And
it was incredible. Years ago, I was an investor in a CrossFit gym. And one of the things we did was different community outreach. And we would reach out to the public school systems. We said, hey, we'll do this basic fitness assessment for the kids in the public school for free. And we'll allow after school programs, at no charge. If you get the kids here, we'll do, these 90-minute programs or 3-hour programs with the kids for basic physical fitness. Yes. What shocked me, and I've talked about this before, was it was a group of 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, and we brought them into the gym, and from Naples Elementary School, and we just did basic testing. One of the tests we did was we had them sit down on a box jump that was 12 inches off the ground, and without their hands, just stand up from a box jump. You would be astounded at the number of 6th and 7th graders that could not stand up unassisted from a box jump. Now, mind you, their butt was a foot off the ground, so they couldn't just take it from that squatted position, stand up, without rolling to the side, without putting their hand down, without putting their hands behind them. And I just remember the coach, TJ was my partner back then, Joey. I remember us looking at these kids going, what the hell? I can't get my arms around this. I mean, and they looked healthy. They were so weak. Their hip flexors. You'd put these kids in a basic plank, and we wouldn't even say hold it for a minute. We would say hold it for 10 seconds. And they would get up in a plank and their butt would just sink down to the floor. They couldn't dead hang for more than 15 or 18, 20 seconds, just hanging under their own weight. So super, super basics. I just remember when I was in high school, PE was pretty intense. Yeah. In grade school, we played like kickball and stuff. By the time I was in high school, PE was like full contact. We called it flag football, but we called it smear the something or other. And we throw the ball up. We just smash each other up. But I mean, we were intensely exercising for that. And I think that's fallen by the wayside. So back to muscle as our metabolic currency. The basic blood panel that you say, adopt a lifestyle of an omnivorous diet, including healthy meats, eggs, yogurts, fermented vegetables. And if you were going to say that one thing makes the greatest difference in what you do in terms of longevity, how many more years you have left on earth, what would that one thing be?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I mean, I would kind of go back and forth with, I think, outdoor exercise and walking, because I could
probably
say
the most
sleep.
underrated activity in the world, walking. Yeah.
I really do think so, because it translates into better sleep, better hormones, better metabolism. So if there's just one tool that you could do, and if you look at the blue zones, this has been very controversial, because the blue zones, the media likes to portray these blue zones as being very plant heavy in their nutrition and
Some
that
of
sort
them
of
are not, actually.
right. And so, but one commonality with the blue zones is they're very physically active. The people that live in amongst community and meaning a purpose and all of this,
community
right?
purpose and very active. Yeah.
Very active. So I think that if you were to look at just one thing, it would be make sure you at least walk 8,000 steps per day. And that was kind of the thesis of my talk today was, you know, most people are just sedentary. And when we're sedentary, even if we go to the gym and we work out, and Edward Coyle and folks over at UT Austin have been studying this, when you relegate people to just walking 2,000 steps per day, when they go and do a HIIT workout for 60 minutes, they actually don't oxidize much fat during that exercise session.
Wow.
It causes a phenomenon known as exercise resistance. So we need to be just recreationally active, just moving all throughout the day, take little exercise snacks or exercise
I love that
breaks.
snack on exercise. I talk about that all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, I think there was a study, I don't want to quote it, but it looked at the difference between a single 45-minute walk in the morning versus 3 15-minute walks. You might have seen this study on the glycemic profile. And the 3 15-minute walks had a substantially greater impact on hemoglobin A1C.
Right.
Even though it was the same duration of exercise, but it was broken up into 15-minute walks after each meal.
Right.
And this goes back to, you know, your comments about the muscle being our, you know, metabolic sponge for glucose. And anything that's going to keep our hemoglobin A1C down for a prolonged period of time is obviously not only going to help us with weight loss, but it's going to help us with a reduction in all-cause mortality. So it's interesting too that I think people sometimes look at the daunting commitment of exercise and they go, I don't have 90 minutes.
Right.
I don't even have 60 minutes. Well, if you've got 8 or 15, 3 different times a day, you could actually spread this out and snack on exercise.
And it would be superior in contrast to just one 45-minute block.
Right.
You know, so I think that is the take home. And if possible, do it outside. Then you're improving your circadian clock health. You're getting, you know, natural vitamin D, for example, help with sleep and sleep pressure so that we fall asleep. So I think that's the most important thing.
Agreed.
And Bannock et al. Just put out a meta-analysis involving, it was using the UK Biobank data, big data set. And he enumerated this, individuals that don't walk at least 8,000 steps per day have a dramatic increase in all-cause mortality and cardiovascular specific mortality. And every 1,000 step decrement off of 8,000 translates into a 15% added risk.
Wow.
So if you just only walk 4,000 steps per day, you're at a 60% higher risk of dying from all causes compared to when you walk 8,000 steps per day. So I think that is really pretty compelling to suggest that we just have to be more active. And here in Europe, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's really few obese or overweight people.
Yeah,
compared to
everybody's
what we see
walking
in the
everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just went out for a walk and I was running into all kinds of people. So
Yeah.
Mike, where does my audience find out more about you? Where can they find you, find out more about what you support and what you're teaching?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. Highintensityhealth.com is my website, and we're pretty active on YouTube. So the channel is just High Intensity Health on YouTube as well. And then if you want to follow me on Instagram, it's metabolic_Mike on Instagram.
Metabolic_Mike. And what big things do you have on horizon that my audience needs to know about?
Yeah, working on a book all about metabolic health to really help people to better understand these concepts because they're pretty simple, but I think people need the research now to really sort of validate what they're doing. And then we have a lot of just great videos, you know, breaking down studies and things like that over on our channel. We've talked a lot about LDL cholesterol, the importance of looking at triglycerides.
Huge. I love it.
So just basic stuff, but people need to hear it because when they go to the doctors are like monomaniacally focused on LDL cholesterol reduction.
So
Meanwhile,
true.
Triglycerides can be through the roof. It's like, hey, why aren't we talking about that?
Such a great message for the masses, man. Such a great message for the masses. Well, thank you for coming on. Get ready for, you know, my audience to find you everywhere.
Thank you so much.
And I appreciate the work you're doing, man. And I appreciate you giving me your time today.
Yeah.
So I wind down every podcast by asking all my guests the same question. And there's no right or wrong answer to this question. That is, what does it mean to you to be an ultimate human?
I love that. I think to be resilient, you know, emotionally, physically, psychologically, athletically, to be resilient. You know, strong people are resilient in all sorts of facets. You know, we all have tough life circumstances, but to bounce back from that, and then also to be physiologically resilient, to be able to travel like we did, and our time zones are all screwed up, and to be able to cognitively perform.
Yep.
I think, you know, resilience is key in all domains of life. And if you look at these different disease states that are characterized by being of poor health, it's just a disease of poor resilience.
Yeah.
From diabetes to depression to what have you. So focusing on being resilient and choosing exercises that improve and modalities that improve resilience.
Yeah, I think
Sauna,
the body would
cold
call
plunge.
this hormesis, right? I mean,
Exactly.
stress with a strengthening response,
Yeah.
but also resilience. And I happen to agree with that. There's no right or wrong answer, but we are definitely aligned on that.
Nice.
And as always, guys, that's just science.